Hello and welcome to session 318 in the AIsafety.com reading group. Tonight we are joined by Otto Barten, the founder and director of the Existential Risk Observatory. Welcome, Otto, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Søren. Super nice that you invited us. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I have collected some questions, and they seem to cluster into three categories broadly. One were underlying confusions or bigger picture strategic assumptions lying behind the view on how we can get an international AI safety treaty. The second were questions relating to more pessimistic scenarios. What do we do, in fact, if we are in a world where the current effort at a treaty is likely to fail? And the third is the more positive, a bit closer to some of your work. Like, is it possible to make incremental regulation go even better? What small tweaks are possible in that domain? The way we will do this in practice is that I have some questions in the queue. I'll maintain a queue such that if some of the others want to, if you have questions, then please write them in the chat, and then I will try to organize that. So to start with some of the strategic confusions, there is a classic metaphor for AI safety. That's like we're in a car that is racing towards some kind of precipice, and we want to stop before that happens. So now I'm just going to need to move some of this so you can actually see what is on this slide. Hold on. So the idea is that we are like in a car that is racing towards some kind of precipice, and eventually we are going to see some kind of like there will be some evals or something that will make it really clear that we need to have some more regulation. So in a sense, things will be clearer and clearer as time goes on, and it'll be easier and easier to get some kind of regulation. There is an alternative, which is the one espoused, for instance, in the how can I put this? In the AI 2027, which is that as time goes by, it becomes harder and harder to get some kind of regulation going because AI becomes much more valuable from an economic point of view, and AI also becomes more capable of hiding misalignment. And that means that it gets worse and worse. And of course, in AI 2027, we reach a point where it is just totally infeasible to do anything in 2027. So the way I thought to operationalize this was, do you think it's harder to reach a treaty now than it was 6 months ago? And will it be even harder in 6 months? Are we in this middle car where we look back and think, if only we had a treaty earlier?
Oh yeah, interesting question. I think we kind of need to start with threat models, as we kind of always need to do, I think, but we aren't doing that so soon. I think the threat model in the AI 2027 scenario is quite different from the one that I'm most concerned about. I would say the one that I'm most concerned about, I would say, is during training or shortly after internal deployment, probably when the first queries are run or the first tests are done on the model. This is what Jutkowski and Bostrom, I think, have described. And here the problem is that the model itself is very powerful. It's not about a position that it has in society or some kind of application, but the model itself is already powerful enough for a takeover and for us to lose control over it. I would say that in the AI 2027 scenario, that threat model is quite different. It is more like gradual disempowerment, which was published before this, and kind of similar to what Paul Christiano has said before, with what failure looks like. And there the threat model is that AI is widely used, and it's already and it's mostly powerful because of its usage and because it is employed in powerful positions. For example, if you put AI in charge of NATO, then it's obviously able to take over because whoever is in charge of NATO is basically able to take over. So including the AI, however bad it is or however incapable it is if it can do anything coherently, then it should be able to take over. Just because of its position. So, and of course, they are assuming in these models that AI is widely used in all kinds of positions and therefore kind of trivially able to take over. So then it's really about alignment. And they assume that we can do this anyway because we might align AI very well and very reliably. And the problem is that if this alignment fails, then we would be in trouble. So I think these threat models are kind of before perhaps the images that you drew on the screen. Although I do think they're quite interesting to look at. I also think there's definitely some truth in both of them. Personally, I think that we are more on the one on top, or at least if we assume that regulation is somehow going to solve this, then I think regulation should become easier and easier to get implemented because the trouble would seem more and more obvious to more and more people. And the more obvious the risks are, I think, of AI, the more easier it is to regulate and the more easy it is to do something about it. However, there's also the countering force that the more and more capable AI is, the more and more attractive it also becomes for investors. So likely, the more and more investment there will be, the more and more important it will be for nation states, perhaps as well, to develop their military capabilities with AI. And for that reason, or for those reasons, more and more difficult it gets to stop as well. So I think these and I would say that would be my main reason for endorsing perhaps the picture below. So I think they're both relevant, and right now it's undecided which one is going to be dominant, I would say.
Okay. So you had a Twitter thread, which was in response to the AI 2027, which sees an 11th hour treaty as both extreme and very unlikely. And depending, like precisely what 11th hour is, like there is 2027, and getting some kind of treaty up like a lot sooner seems difficult. So, but you are more optimistic, both that we will, as far as I can tell, get some kind of regulation going a lot earlier, and that will be more effective. At least this is what I get out of this quote. So one really basic thing that I'm confused about is, are you primarily talking about national and international regulation? Because we see some potential problems with this, in that the U.S. national administration seem to be pretty, I want to say, unaligned on this, and also seem that while there is some hope of some kind of international cooperation, this seems much less about slowing AI, but much more about steering AI. And this, like, if slowing down by decades, seem pretty pretty much outside of the Overton window. So could you start by answering this question, I guess? Which of these two are you most optimistic about?
About national or international regulation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say either would work. If you have good national regulation in all countries developing AGI or going in this direction, then I think it would be sufficient. You could go even lower if all the states, for example, in the US, would have sufficient regulation. That would also be sufficient, I think. However, I think it makes most sense to have an international treaty. This is classically the way in which these issues are solved, or at least in which the situation is improved. This is very much, I think, a problem of cooperation between countries, and for such an issue, a treaty is the default solution, I think. So I think a treaty makes most sense, but it's not dependent on a treaty. Without a treaty, you could also have national regulation in the US and national regulation in China doing more or less the same thing, and that would be sufficient. So perhaps this could be easier politically to implement.
So I know it's an unfair question to ask people to put like probabilities on this, but roughly what kind of probability would you put on U.S. national regulation strongly slowing down AI and like a strong international treaty? What are your two probabilities, very roughly?
So it's very difficult to put a number on this, but I think that an international treaty is not less likely than national regulation. I think national regulation slowing down AI or pausing AI, especially for a longer time, that seems more unlikely, I would say, than a treaty because it makes less sense. I mean, and I do kind of understand the fear in the US that if they pause for a longer time, then the Chinese will overtake them. I don't think that's a realistic scenario mostly. And the way, of course, to end on the
What do you
same.
mean you don't think it's a realistic scenario?
Sorry.
When you say you don't think it's a realistic scenario,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
do think that would be a realistic scenario. So I do understand this
oh,
fear.
okay, sorry.
Uh, so for that reason, I think a treaty makes more sense, and I think a treaty might have a higher chance of getting accepted also in the US than unilateral regulation. However, you could say, okay, we're going to regulate unilaterally if the Chinese are also doing this. That's kind of a treaty, but it's actually two times national regulation might also work.
Okay. So one of the things when I thought about this that I thought might be some kind of underlying crux is like, what is the probability that if we don't take any particular action with regards to AI safety, we don't make any kind of treaty, what is the probability that things will go well? Where my model of this is one where this is almost certainly going to be to go very, very wrong, in that AI is going to be extremely strategic, extremely strategically important, and extremely powerful. And I am wondering if could it be that some of the underlying disagreement here could be in like how powerful will AI be? Will some of the capabilities in AI 2027 actually come to pass? Do you think this is the underlying disagreement?
I don't know if if this is the underlying disagreement and if this is such a crux. I do think it's super important, but it's something that we cannot do much about, right? It's just like apparently the universe is such that AI will turn out to be, or AI will have certain capabilities, and it's something that we can't do much about. I am a little, well, I'm not really optimistic about this. I do expect AI to be very powerful, but I could be wrong, and I'm acknowledging that I could be wrong here, and all a safety space could basically be wrong here, and that AI will just turn out not to be that powerful in the end. I do think that for AI 2027, there's actually less power required than for my threat model. For AI 2027, basically human level is required, but not really anything else. Because what they're saying is they're expecting AI to be in charge of lots of things, and this would happen if it has at least human level and maybe a little bit above human level. But if it's just human level, between brackets, but cheaper, that's already a great reason to put it in charge of lots of things. Or at least a reason that may be used to put it in charge of lots of things. So I think for their threat model, no super intelligence is needed, right? And no superhuman AI. Well, for my threat model, I also don't think that super intelligence is needed in the style that Bostrom is writing about it, but I do think sufficient capabilities for takeover are needed. So I would say it's definitely important what peak AGI is going to be, and I would say, or peak AI, the most capable AI that can be constructed. Let's say the most capable AI that will be constructed in the next 1,000 years or something. The most capable that we as humanity will turn out, maybe with AI aid, will turn out to be able to construct. And I think it is a possibility that this will turn out to be less than takeover level, at least according to the Yudkowsky-Bostrom scenario. So that would be nice. It's kind of free pass out of jail for that threat scenario. And then we're still left with a threat scenario of AI 2027, which is much more about where are we going to apply it. And I think that's a very societal problem.
Yeah, I think I agree with this. And also, one thing that I noticed from your Twitter thread was that you disagreed very much on like the importance of the technical work. And I think I agree with you very much there. So I don't actually want to dig very much into that, but I want to dig more into where do you regulate? Because you say that like traditional regulation might be the way to go. Just you've developed the model and then you test it in some way, and if it's too powerful, then you don't deploy it. So if we assume that we are in a world where we get something like GPT-6, which is like the human maximum, something like IQ 200, like the smartest person who's ever lived, but not really smarter than that. But it's really good at some kind of strategic cognitive task. And we've spent a lot of effort building this model. We've spent an appreciable fraction of GDP if the projections continue. And then there is some regulation that prohibit the deployment. And then the part that I don't understand happens. And then we get existential safety, at least for a couple of decades. And like these 3 dots here is where my uncertainty is. Like you imagine that there would be some kind of race here, and there would be very, very strong incentives to deploy this model. And if we don't do it, then China will. And like it seems like that a lot of things have to happen in this step. Could you try to fill out the blanks, please?
Not really sure if I understand your model correctly, but let's just first say, okay, so we're talking about a threat model in AGI 2027, right? So this is kind of similar to what people call gradual disempowerment. If that's the threat, is that true, or?
I think for both, actually. I might in fact be more interested in hearing how the 3 dots fit into your world model with your threat model.
Well, so I think we should separate these 2 threat models because the answer is very different from which one we're talking about. So let's first say the gradual disempowerment threat model that's also central to AGI 2027. In that case, I would say, okay, where does this threat model originate from? It originates from AI being employed at powerful positions. And if we do not employ AGI at powerful positions, this whole threat model never comes to pass, in my opinion. Do you agree with that part?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the powerful position, that's in practice like the drop-down button in chat.openai.com, where you can select the models, and the powerful position we're talking about specifically is whether GPT-6 is available in that drop-down.
No, I would say that's different. That's not the point where we apply it, but it is the model itself, the capabilities of the model itself. I would say the point where we apply it. So, for example, if we decide to make AI head of NATO, that's a very powerful position, or the CEO of a big company, or the president of a large, powerful country. That's a position where an AI could take over. Or if we don't apply it to one such powerful position, but we apply it to in the entire economy in lots of positions in such a way that AI could take over trivially because we put it in charge of so many things. And now it's really about alignment. In that case, if that's your threat model, I would say do not employ it to that position. Do not employ it to positions that are so powerful that it could take over without apparently checking your alignment extremely carefully. So I would say, and that's what the EU AI Act is already regulating, right? I mean, the EU AI Act is already saying, okay, if your AI is in charge of something very powerful, then you should make sure that it's functioning very well. If it is in something applied to something less powerful, then the regulation is less important. So I would say if this is your threat model, then I would propose EU-style regulation after deployment and on the point of application. I would also say, personally, I'm skeptical that we can ever make alignments functioning well. Yeah, I don't really know, but at least with anything like current alignment, I would say it's completely impossible to let AI be in charge of NATO, for example, because you're never quite sure what it's going to do. And I also think this will be widely publicly recognized. I mean, the public very much understands that AI can hallucinate right now, for example. So if you would right now propose to put AI in charge of NATO, then no one would agree with this, right? The military would not agree with this, the public would not agree with this, politicians would not agree with this, media would not agree with this. So it's squarely impossible. However, so if AI would become a lot more powerful and alignment would seem to be more correct, then this might be a risk. But I would say in any case we should regulate this at the point of application and not really at the point of development. However, for a different threat model, so if the threat model is more like Yudkowsky/Bostrom, and this is not at the point of application, but it's at the point of development, and it's either during training even, or just after training when the first tests are run, That's the threat model where mostly the conditional A safety treaty was meant to protect us from. If we're talking about a conditional A safety treaty, then I would say focusing on this threat model makes most sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think this this clarifies something for me. It seems like one of the areas where like I think I don't actually know who's the head of NATO, right? But I expect that person has probably used ChatGPT for something, probably not for the really important strategic things, but like bouncing ideas off they have probably a version that is more secure. But I think like many CEOs, I'm confident many CEOs, when they have some new strategy they want to propose, they run it by ChatGPT to see if it has any particular. Do you think this is the kind of deployment that is likely to be regulated?
I think in this case, at least the final responsibility, but I think also the practical decision power is still with a human individual. I do think that if AI would become so good that these decisions would actually originate from AI, I would not be surprised if it would be regulated indeed. But it's still a good point that of course human individuals in power positions could use AI so much that it would become a danger too. I think that's maybe you can describe it as a separate threat model, but I do think it's an interesting remark for sure.
Okay. Great. That was like roughly the first third of the questions. Now, one of the threat models that I think is most important is the more pessimistic scenarios. It's not really a threat model in the way we talked about before, but more like we imagine that there is some kind of future scenario where the capabilities continue to improve roughly as they are right now, and coordination continues to fail roughly as it is now. But we do get some kind of warning shot, like maybe an abortive takeover attempt or something like that. And this is something that in my model gives us a number of possibilities for getting some kind of treaty out. Do you agree that this is a potentially important possible scenario?
Yeah, it seems quite realistic, I think, yes.
Right. Let's dive into some of the options. So we could have, in fact, made an emergency pause treaty. We can make one literally right now that can then be ready if there is some kind of takeover scenario. And the face of it, that seems pretty stupid in the sense that we will, of course, know a lot more in the future. But there are a number of potential upsides to this approach. So if we imagine that there is some kind of attempted takeover or imminent takeover or something like that, then if we have a treaty that we have like pre-committed to in some sense, then that will probably be a lot easier because it can be much more neutral. Like the politicians who would normally negotiate this treaty, they are probably occupied with the coup or takeover, and they're under like a really, really strong time pressure and other kinds of strategic pressure. And you could imagine trust breaking down. Whereas some kind of emergency pause treaty would have been made behind a kind of Rawls veil in a sense, right? Because this is written before we knew who is to blame, before we know who will get a lot of benefit from this, and we have a stronger a more legitimate claim to neutrality if the treaty is made in advance. And I think this kind of forgiveness isn't just something that is like nice and as an end in itself, but something that can potentially have large strategic benefits. These are some of the potential upsides. And what do you think? Is this a really important thing to do now?
I think like thinking about what we would do if something happens that we think is relatively likely and important is in general good to prepare for. So I would say thinking about what types of AI safety treaties we might have once the public awareness might be there or public pressure even towards politicians to actually accept this. I do think that's important, yes.
Would there be potential negative downsides, like we're planning on this, or people will say we are planning to, take over the world or whatever? Is like, what are the downsides of this? Can you think?
I wouldn't be too worried about that. I would say so. I talked to someone from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs who had a record of working in international diplomacy, and they said that it actually practically, if you prepare the exact clauses of a treaty, that's a bit less easy to get accepted because in any case you will need someone to champion this who can actually pull it through. Like for SB 1047, they had one of the senators who was championing this treaty. I forgot his name now, but and that person and his team, they will do the actual drafting of the treaty. So you can it kind of makes it a bit more difficult even if you have done the drafting already to get your points implemented. I think you should optimize to what's most useful for their team, and I think what's most useful for that team is to just write down which points are important to get in the treaty and leave the legal language to them. But that's kind of a technical point, but it is one reason why we didn't draft an actual treaty, but only give recommendations. But in general, thinking ahead and thinking about what should be in the treaty and already discussing this, I think that's very important, yes. And I don't see strong downsides for doing that.
Great. Okay, I thought to myself about like how can we make some kind of restriction, and one of the ways I suggested would be to focus on Bostrom's 6 strategic cognitive tasks, which is of course a something that is really strong in the sense that it prohibits basically most AI development for the past 5 years or something like that. The advantage of being like too strong is that it solves AI X risk, and it points towards like the actual problem, in that it points that it's in fact this strategic cognitive capability that is in fact the problem. But of course it cuts way too deep in the sense that, GPT-1 is technically covered by that, and nobody believes that GPT-1 will be able to do something. So this is an attempt at making something like really, really clear and pointing towards the problem, but also has a number of downsides that may be better. So I'm kind of pointing towards a confusion in how important is it to have something that is like really, really clear and legible and have a perfect red line versus something that destroys as little value as possible, right? So this is one thing. And the other thing I'm wondering about is prohibiting research is a really, really contentious area. And I'm like, this suggestion does not prohibit research into AI. And it seems like like if there's any way to avoid prohibiting research, it might be worthwhile to go to great lengths to avoid that. So what are your thoughts on making this kind of clause for an emergency pause treaty to just straight up ban all the kinds of AI that's been made basically the past 5 years?
I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere, right? So, I mean, you can't just say long horizon strategic planning is off the charts without kind of defining what at which points you think the red lines are crossed. And what we're doing is using the evals for that, and that is also it's not trivially the correct path, but I think someone will have to decide how close is too close. And right now we're also doing that, and our decision is as a society everything is fine and we don't block anything, and I think that's and right now the public is deciding this. I would say that if you have an AA safety treaty, conditional AA safety treaty, then you're putting this responsibility from the public that has it now to the AA safety institutes, and the AA safety institutes are going to run evals, and they will need to decide what's too close to loss of control and who's crossing the red lines. I think that would be a market improvement, although I'm not so. I mean, it still comes with a host of risks, actually. I mean, it's very non-obvious where those red lines are exactly. There's no scientific agreement on them. There's not even scientific agreement on the existence of takeover, so also on the existence of a red line. So threat models are still quite debated. So it's a very non-trivial task, but I do think it would be a better world if this would be at the AI safety institutes than where this decision is right now, either at the companies themselves or at the public at some point. So that's into a little bit into the red lines and where they are and who should decide on this. I think prohibiting research. My main issue with this, so it's also of course politically quite complicated, and you will get lots of pushback from scientists and from other people. But I think perhaps even more important is that it's quite difficult to actually enforce this regulation. Someone can do research in their garage, and how are you going to do that? So I think if you propose regulation, by far, there could be arguments perhaps for proposing unenforceable regulation, but I think if you can propose enforceable regulation, that's way better. So the default state should be that you're proposing something that is actually enforceable. And I think hardware regulation right now is the best candidate, at least for doing this. So I wouldn't really look too closely into research regulation myself.
Great. I think we will get into more with the hardware regulation later. So there is another element that is like Pause AI right now have a suggested or a very draft version of a pause treaty. And if you want to have a pause, then and it's not a stop, then you need some kind of unpausing criteria. And so the one in Pause AI is like 6 months. And that would be one option for, in particular, we're talking about the context of a emergency pause treaty, where we are witnessing very, very clearly a takeover, and we need something right now that can be implemented very quickly. So, like, it's a possibility to have some kind of time-based criteria, which obviously could fail if it turns out that building safe AI might take a long time. And I think, in particular, in the explicit situation where we have an AI takeover, there's a good chance that building safe AI is actually really hard, because we have, by definition, failed already of this. So it could, in fact, take a long time. A classic alternative for an unpausing criteria would be vote-based. The UN Security Council is probably the best bet in my view. It's like a really strong procedure, but of course it is far from perfect. Like putting the fate of the future into the hands of the UN Security Council does seem less than optimal for many people. Then a third option for unpausing is that we've unpaused when we have, in fact, solved alignment to some extent, which would either be like solving the full alignment problem, where we like have answers to all the questions in Bostrom's book, basically, or we have a number of alternatives. There's the Guaranteed Safe AI agenda by Joshua Bengio and Stuart Russell and many others, which has some levels that seem really both pretty concrete and pretty safe. There is corrigibility. There are a number of corrigibility requirements where you could imagine some kind of, like, if you submit maybe to the Security Council or something like that, an AI that, and you have proof that it satisfies these criteria or something like that, then that would be an option for saying, okay, now the powers stop because we have in fact solved this. And then, of course, for completeness, there is the permanent option of just straight up never building AI, like in Doom, with the Butlerian Jihad. I think I dislike that personally, and probably a lot of people also, but for completeness it is in fact an option, right? And it could make sense to combine some of these in a treaty. Maybe say like 2 of the 3 needs to be fulfilled, so you need either 24 months to have passed, or like and something, the UN Security Council resolution, or research plus time-based or something like that. So you have like 2 out of 3 or something like that. What are your thoughts on the best way to write a treaty with a temporary pause, and when do you unpause?
It's quite an interesting debate, and I haven't looked closely into all the possibilities here. For example, the proof of the standard 16 standard corrigibility requirements does sound quite interesting, but I'm not really familiar with the details, so I can't really comment on it, unfortunately. But in general, I would say um, my emphasis would be that we do not only need to solve technical alignment, but we also need to solve social alignment. And I think that's a bit underappreciated in much of the AI safety space. That I don't think this is a technical problem is a part of it. You need to first step, if you like, is that you know that your superintelligence, let's say, is reliably doing what you're asking it to do, or what somehow we are well telling it to do, maybe. So this could be. And I mean, the technical part needs to be solved in any case. That's one thing. I'm not really sure which criteria to apply for this, but some technical people are better at this, I think. But also that of course opens up the giant Pandora's box. How are you going to align it? Who are you going to align it with? I think there are three main schools. You have intent alignment, value alignment, and CEV, coherent extrapolated volition. CEV is Bostrom/Witkowski's solution. Value alignment is what you sometimes hear in effective altruism. Intent alignment is, I think, what's practically most discussed and prepared for at the labs and people building AI. I think the big downside of value alignment and coherent extrapolated volition is that I don't really see it being corrigible. I don't think once this is actually running and you turn out to have implemented the wrong values, or you turn out to have implemented CEV in a way that's actually not future proof, then I don't think there's anything you can do about this. And I don't trust the wisdom of our species, and maybe even less the wisdom of those developing AI, or at least I don't trust either of them sufficiently to implement something uncorrigible. So I think corrigibility should be a minimum demand. So for that reason, I think intent alignment is actually most promising. However, for intent alignment, you have the huge issue, whose intent? So I don't think it's acceptable to say Sam Altman is controlling the fate of humanity for the rest of the however many years we have. I also don't think it's acceptable to say Donald Trump is doing this. And that's not just because I'm not a Republican, but in general, any one president, I think, is not even worse, perhaps, if we would also solve aging at some point and you're stuck with someone forever. I think that's an unacceptable way to solve this. So I would say I find it very hard to solve this problem at all, and perhaps that is actually the reason that we should not build a superintelligence altogether, or find some other perhaps power sharing option. But if you're pressing me to propose something, then I would say a UN committee and then an intent aligned superintelligence controlled by this UN committee, something like this, might be the most palatable option for me. I would also so that's a few words about social alignment, so technical alignment, social alignment, and I think we should also have a vote on this. So I do think that someone like I don't know if the UN Security Council is the best position, but I do think if something is that important, we should have some kind of a democratic decision-making process there as well, that this is publicly discussed. We have referendums on this, perhaps in many countries, or some other kind of political decision-making process, and UN congregation about these the results of these referendums. So I think all three are in my mind required before we unpause, especially, and this depends quite a bit on how powerful AI will be. You know, I mean, if it's only AGI and that's all it can do, that's already a big thing, but it's not super intelligence. So I would say if we're at takeover level, so I like to talk about takeover level AI or TL AI. Then I think these are most important, and we should be most stringent about the unpausing criteria. If someone can demonstrate to me with a great proof that we will only get to AGI level but never to takeover level AI, then we're it's quite different territory, I would say.
Interesting. Okay. One perhaps more ambitious social alignment sub goal could be something like the kind of thing that is gestured towards in Elisa Yudkowsky's Dathi Land. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with this.
I'm not sure, but if you're going to go on talking about it, I might be.
I don't. I think if you're not familiar with it, then I don't think I can do that justice. So I think I will. Yeah. Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate it.
Thank
Another
you.
thing is like a bit of history in the sense that like the thing that my mind kind of returns to is on September 11th, the United States went through a very historic change, and one of the things that changed the legal landscape very much was the fact that like John Ashcroft had prepared the Patriot Act, so which was like a huge amount of legislation that was pushed through because it had been prepared, even though at the time it was written there was absolutely no chance it could be passed. And there are other examples I could think of, like NATO preparing before, and also the Soviet Union, and a possible counterexample, which would be the League of Nations that got a large amount of traction immediately after the First World War, but then things took too long. The Overton window kind of closed, and the United States famously never ratified the League of Nations. And like people were insufficiently prepared in some sense. So this is like my way of going through the historical record in a very biased fact because I'm not a professional. So I like these are the examples that I come up with that end up making me conclude that this is really really important. But of course, I kind of don't see all the examples where like this kind of preparation wasn't really very necessary. So like I think it's really important. Do you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, um, I think, I mean, warning shots are one possibility for the overdrawn window to shift quite a bit. I do think capabilities improvements are also a way for the overdrawn window to shift. That has happened already at when GPT-4 and ChatGPT were launched. That's not really what you call a warning shot. I mean, I'm not sure if they made any casualties, but I don't think it was too dramatic. However, just because of increased capabilities and because people could see this, the overdrawn window already shifted quite a bit with respect to what it was before. So I would say that future capabilities increase will probably also shift the overdrawn window. I definitely think it's crucial where it is. I would. It would kind of make sense that the capabilities of AI are increasing. After that, the level of public awareness is increasing, and after that, there would be this would constitute an overdrawn window shift, and there would be a possibility to get regulation passed. I think if we are in this position that there's really a great demand for regulation, I'm not even sure if I would still propose the conditional AI safety treaty. Maybe that's the time to propose an AI safety treaty that's no longer conditional because there's already support to do something right now. Easy part of our conditional AI safety treaty is that you can just cut off the conditionality or even leave it in there, and then the conditionality is already satisfied since we've had the warning shots already, so everyone knows that the capabilities are already too close to loss of control. That's also a possibility. So I think at this point the conditionality loses its added value, and it's more about what the rest of the treaty looks like. But I think you can also put it to use in that way.
I think an obvious you pointed out a really obvious historical parallel that I did not, which was like the release of ChatGPT, which did in fact change public opinion very much, and I think that's a really good example. To like it also probably shifted opinions about what kind of AI treaty. How did it change the Overton window with regards to AI treaties? Do you remember what was your feeling back when ChatGPT was announced? How did the Overton
Yeah,
window
so
change?
not much yet with respect to AI treaties. I think AI treaties are so we've measured what the levels of public awareness of AI existential risk are. We're measuring this in a certain survey-based way. You can read the details in the paper, but according to the first measurement before ChatGPT, this was about 7%, and then after ChatGPT, it moved to around 18%. That's the most recent measurement that we have done. But I think before it's at still higher levels, maybe even 50%. It might be hard to get this really passed. Although I do still think that's I mean, it's a good rallying point, the 3D as well, and I think it's something that you could propose right now that should be accepted right now. I honestly believe it should be implemented right now to have a conditional AI safety treaty. And it's something that you can campaign for well as well. But to be honest, I think a safety treaty is more likely to be implemented if we have higher levels of awareness still. Another, by the way, historical equivalent that might be interesting is the EU ETS emission trading scheme. This was implemented and what is a bit similar to the conditional AI safety treaty. So this emission trading scheme is to reduce our climate impact, and it was implemented at a time when all the companies were just getting free permits. So for them, it would not hurt their bottom line at all, and it would basically not hurt anyone's bottom line. Would also not do that much because they were just giving away the permits for free. However, slowly there's more and more pressure building upon this, and I think part of the reason that people agreed with this at the time was because it wasn't hurting them for the next 5 or 10 years, and that's anyway their CEO term, right? So, but I think if you like, the conditional AI safety treaty can do something a little bit similar. That for people who think that these kind of capabilities are still far away, they might as well agree. There's nothing in this treaty for them to disagree. And then once the capabilities are actually closer, then the treaty is already in place. So maybe that's another historical equivalent.
Yeah, that's another good point. I've mostly focused on overturn windows shifting due to fire alarms and warning shots, but you're right that capabilities could in fact also do this. What particular capabilities do you feel would shift the overturn window dramatically towards making a treaty feasible?
I think agentic AI will do quite a bit if we get this. I also fear agentic AI. I mean, I think agentic AI could, it's very difficult right now. It's extremely unclear what we actually need for a takeover. But it could be that something that's working properly agentically is already sufficient. So it does seem risky. But I do think if we have agentic AI that's just properly doing jobs over a longer time span from A to Z and is succeeding with doing things in the real world, that would convince a lot of people, I think, that this is also really dangerous. So at least from a bad actor perspective, but maybe even from a misalignment perspective. So I think that would increase the political regulation possibilities quite a bit. Also what people are looking into now, for example, can bad actors create viruses with this? That's obviously also something that's publicly relevant. If we would get to a level where we actually have a bad actor and they're creating a virus with this, and we get something like a COVID or even something like a SARS, of course that would change the public debate quite a bit as well. There are probably quite a lot of other cruxes. I think personally, convincing humans is quite important, convincing humans to do stuff. I'm having a relatively difficult time imagining a takeover without an AI being able to convince people to do stuff. But if it gets good at that, I would personally say it's quite alarming. Also, longer time horizon tasks, more strategic thinking. That seems quite dangerous to me. But I'm not sure what these capabilities will do to public awareness exactly.
Two other capabilities that are sometimes mentioned in this are the ability of AIs to engage romantically with people. To some extent, this is already happening, and this could potentially happen at a much larger scale. The other is robotics. There are a lot of debate about to what extent robotics is bottlenecked on AI or bottlenecked on like physical things. But if it turns out that it's mostly bottlenecked on AI, then it is conceivable that we could have like a lot of robots doing a lot of things very soon.
Yeah, I agree, especially with the latter that this might be important for public awareness as well. Yes.
Great. I can see there's been no questions from the chat, which is nice. We were so well prepared that we didn't have any questions in the chat. But I mean, please, if you have some questions, please feel free to interject. So what can we do now to prepare? So we could do like reviews and recommendations, which is like literally in the title of your paper. So this is the thing we are doing right now, but we could do more, of course. Then my suggestion would be to draft some kind of treaty, emergency treaty. That's what we've talked about. But there are other options. We could draft some kind of modular treaty. Like we could like if it turns out that we are in this particular situation, then instead of just having drafted like one option, we could draft a number and organize them in some way. We could also figure out like what are the people who are interested in doing in working on this kind of pause, if there is some kind of overturn window, and figuring out if there is a shift in the overturn window, what are the actual actors we should convince. And finally, we could create some kind of playbook if this happened and it's like a hacking based takeover, and China is originating from China, then we do this. So this kind of strategic modeling. So these are some of the things we could do, but I'm unsure which are most effective. Where, if by effective, I mean this important, neglected, tractable, and of course also, like I mentioned, these 6 general sub areas that are useful. But maybe there is a 7th that is more important that I haven't thought about. What are your thoughts on these 6?
Yeah, I think there are many quite neglected and quite important fields that people should be working on. I do agree that these seem important. I would say, in addition, perhaps I would say what I think is the most important is creating awareness. Still, I think, for example, I'm quite a fan of the For Humanity podcast that has been launched not so long ago. That's about 120K subscriptions now, and I think these kind of podcasts, and of course also the host of other communication that has been done on the topic, is shifting public awareness. It's a slow process, but when it happens, it's really powerful, and perhaps we need it. I also think general lobbying efforts is quite important. I was pleasantly surprised, I have to say, by the EU AI Act and the extent to which it is already regulating AI companies. For example, right now they have to file a responsible scaling policy and discuss this with the AI office. I think that's quite powerful, especially since one tier was also related to a pause. So what kind of capabilities would be needed for you to pause? Loss of control was also mentioned in the appendix. So I think there's quite a lot there to use. If the Brussels effect would be effective, it would be even better. But it does show that this kind of lobbying that was not even done by that many people, I think, in the European Union, is extremely effective. So we should definitely do more of that. And research-wise, I think something that's still quite neglected. I see this as 2 related coordination problems. You have one coordination problem in between countries, and this is what the Conditional AI Safety Treaty is meant to solve or adjust at least. We have only 5 minutes left to see. Okay, but it should be good, I think. The other one is coordination in between or inside one country. Let's say that the US would really want to prohibit AI development in the US, or would want to regulate this, or would want to control it in some way. Could it actually do that? And I think that really depends on how big these training runs are. If one training run costs you $1 billion or even 100 million or 10 million, I think it is almost trivially possible. Because you could simply go to these companies that generally law-abiding, and you could say, okay, stop doing those training runs. And I think that would practically work. But it would work only if those training runs are really big, and if those training runs are 100K or even less, or even that anyone can do it on their own GPU at home. Then of course this approach is not working anymore. And what is working then, that is an unsolved problem, I think, at this point. So if we end up in a world where algorithmic improvement is really important and people can do training runs on not a lot of hardware anymore, I would say that's the coordination problem inside the country, as opposed to between countries, and that's not solved, I think. So that would really be high on my list of research that I think should be done.
I have a question. So it sounds like this would work really well in Europe, but for the players that actually matter, like China and the United States, how would you convince them? Because like I don't think I've really heard anyone with a particularly good model of what the Chinese government really needs in order to agree to such a agreement. And also, yeah.
I mean, it hinges. So yeah, I'm coming back to public awareness all the time because I think that's crucial. And
Well, I
if you
mean,
don't have,
public awareness is irrelevant in China because, like, the people who actually
yeah,
make
no,
these decisions are actually in
I'm,
the
I,
Politburo.
I mean, I see that point to an extent. Of course, China is not a democracy, and I've lived in China actually for half a year, so I do know a little bit about how the country is functioning, but although not that much. But of course, the situation is somewhat different in China. But even in China, Xi Jinping can probably not make decisions completely by himself. I do think or let's say he's very likely absorbing inspiration from other people around him.
Yeah, but
And
it's just that the problem is I don't really know anyone uh in AI governance who has a good model of what the Chinese government wants, what conditions it can agree to, what its current thoughts are, so on and so forth. It's not there's very few people. There's literally no one. And I'm including, people in China who like try to do stuff like this, but for various reasons they end up being basically entirely staffed by like Chinese Americans who are completely culturally assimilated into America, and they don't really have any idea what's going on in China, and they like try to write like policy essays and stuff, and they haven't gotten anywhere. So like, uh, what do you think we can do about that going forward?
so without some level of, let's say, humanity awareness of what the risk actually is, it's not going to be solved in any way. I think the more of that level of awareness we have, the more paths forward I see. I think if I think the Chinese elite is reading quite a lot actually of what's written in the West as well. When we published the first Time article, me and Romy and Polsky, we actually got emails from two Chinese journalists who are interested in this as well. So they're clearly reading that, and they're clearly also discussing these thoughts, I think, among the Chinese elite. And so if there would be a consensus in the West that this is something really dangerous that we need to solve, and this consensus is building, I think. I mean, there was a great column in the New York Times a few months ago stating exactly this, and of course, Time Magazine has done good work, and other outlets. So I think this consensus is slowly building, but I think if there was really a consensus that this is the biggest problem and we have to solve this and it's crucial for everyone, then I think the Chinese would quite likely get on board with that as well. And
I mean,
there have already been statements as well on quite a high political level in China that they do think that AI regulation is important. So I don't see this as impossible.
yeah.
But I mean, sorry.
I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those cultural things where people in Chinese government, well, basically everyone in China would just say stuff that sounds nice because that's like apparently what you're supposed to do, right? It's like when you're submitting a paper for publication, you have to check the box and say, yes, this is how I'm going to use the knowledge from this paper to make the world a better place. In China, if you hear there's like a international thing that people are worried about, you get in front of like some journalists and say, yes, we take this very seriously and we will look into it into the future. And then you don't actually look into it in the future because you don't actually care. Like it is incredibly difficult to like actually communicate information between, actual China and like the rest of the world because it is very difficult for people who lived in China for decades, like including Chinese Americans who are like in order to like actually get information across. It takes an incredible amount of effort. Not a huge amount of people are doing it, and the information that does cross the barrier basically gets drowned out by people's like other people's really like guesses and gut instincts, I guess, and just general stereotypes instead of what's actually happening. I mean, I'm sure after this conversation, like you're probably not going to be massively concerned and not going to like my guess is that you wouldn't know where to start to actually get really good information about what the Chinese elite are doing, and you'll just keep trying to raise public awareness or whatever and hope it works. But I don't know. Yeah.
Could we? Yeah. Um, is what could convince you, Otto, that this is in fact an intractable problem? Um,
I'm not saying it's intractable. I'm just saying that no one cares about the problem to work on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say we won't know until it's there, until we're at crunch time, so to speak. So in a sense, nothing would convince me. I mean, in the end of the earth would convince me that we were apparently unable to save it, and that's true, of course.
No,
But
I'm saying that what that like, I think I think we might be. Sorry, are you about to leave? Are you on a time crunch right now?
I can spend a few minutes. It's okay.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah,
So,
it's not about like the world is doomed. It's more like people in the West need a much better model of what's actually going on in Beijing. And no one cares enough about that, even though it's like the most important thing to actually get a treaty working is to understand what people in Beijing, what the Chinese government actually wants. And and every time I bring this up, the only thing the other person will say is we need to try harder to raise public awareness and hope really hard that this will somehow cause elites in China to pay attention. And then yeah, I don't know. I know I sound like a complete asshole right now, but like I've had this
I mean,
conversation more.
I think it's a legitimate concern that I mean, we're not Chinese, right? And in the end, we would also need, by the way, 330 other nations or something to sign, of which we
No,
also don't know.
that's not true at all. You only need two players, China and the United States. Everyone else isn't even playing the game.
Yeah, I mean, right now they're definitely ahead. So I agree, and it's in fact also what we propose that China and the US are crucial right now. And of course, it's like we're not Chinese, so we're never going to find out, or exactly, perhaps.
No, no,
I,
it's
I,
not. It's not.
I do agree with you that it is important to look at political palatability at all sides, and also on the US side, right? I mean, with the Trump administration, it might also be quite difficult to get something accepted, something like this accepted right now. But I do think it's important that we keep putting pressure on these governments. I also think that, and we should definitely use media and use the public as much as possible. I also think that this whole field is very much in flux still. So right now, if AI capabilities are getting more or less constant for some time, or are staying more or less constant, then you can see that the public opinion is getting less concerned about this. But if they're rising steeply, then people do have significant concern, as what happened after the release of GPT-4, and that's true both in the US and China and in other places as well. So I think opportunities will arise, and I think what we should do is prepare as well as possible to do this. However, if you're in an opportunity to model the situation and the Chinese government better, and to get a better answer to what kind of interventions we should do to in the end make them accept something like this, I think that could be very valuable work for sure.
Yeah.
Great.
The problem is I don't know what the Chinese government really wants at all. I don't think the vast majority of people in China do at all either. So I mean that's a
So,
real problem.
so one thing we could talk about instead is the EU, because we know a lot more about the EU, and I imagine also in particular, because in many scenarios the EU doesn't have a lot of influence because the strong AIs are not being built here really. But we do in fact have a number of levers, right? We can say to the Americans that they can't have access to our market, they can't have our data, they can't have this chip producing machines unless they make sure that the AI is safe. And in my model, I think there's actually a substantial chance that something like this is going to come to a head. That the EU is going to make some very substantial demands of the United States in order to keep to maintain market access. Possibly not over AI safety so much as over like general data sharing and tariffs and things like that. But I'm pretty confused about this. Do you see something like this being something that the EU can in fact do? We will only accept American AI if it is safe.
I think we have quite a lot of levers to use actually, and we're not really using them right now. So I think the EU could do quite a bit. Market access is only one of the things, right? But I mean, what Trump is all the time doing is mixing files. I don't know, asking for some kind of a um, asking for something in the economic domain while actually wanting something military, etc. I think we could also do that, and he has lots of levers to pull. I think I do think close to this domain, ASML is quite important, and other European suppliers actually are also probably important for the whole supply chain. So I think we could use those, and we could use those to ask for, well, for example, for China and the US to sign a safety treaty. I'm not sure if they would do so right away, but I think we have quite a lot of possibilities to do this.
So this is actually moving on to what we will talk about next time. But the EU is have put out a public request for suggestions for how to improve the EU. Now let me just see if I have somewhere here this DPAI code of practice, where they are asking literally for feedback on how can we improve the EU AI regulations. What are your thoughts? What should the EU do better? If you had perfect control over the EU, what would the EU do?
I mean, there's so there is an safety answer to this and a general interest of EU citizens answer to this, and I think that's perhaps quite different. For EU citizens, I do think it's important that we develop AI ourselves as well, and that we're not too far behind China and the US. That does make sense for national interest purposes. I think for safety purposes, that will probably be net negative, in my opinion. I think for safety purposes, I think they could use their negotiation quite well to get international a safety regulation and international a safety treaty accepted. I think the EU could probably do that. We have a good enough negotiation position to do something like this. Of course, the Brussels effect is also, there's actually two Brussels effects that get discussed sometimes. One is that companies who want to trade on the European market would need to obey Brussels regulation as well. Another one is that Brussels regulation might be exemplary for some other countries, causing them to implement equivalent regulation. I think, well, especially the first one might be important. I think the AI Act and especially the Code of Conduct is already fairly powerful, and if everyone would actually enact this, we would have already solved a bit of the problem. However, I'm not really convinced that it's going to work well. I think if you are a startup in the US, if I were a startup in the US, the EU AI Act would not be the first thing on my mind, but I would first try to make sure that I would actually have a powerful model, find market fit, find someone who wants to pay for this, and only after you've done all that, then maybe worry about how to get the whole thing aligned with EU regulation. So that would not be a Brussels effect, and if such a model would become uncontrollable, then the EU regulation might be irrelevant. So I think the EU regulation itself, but I mean, there's still hope. I would say that the Brussels effect does turn out to be powerful for the leading lab. So I think that's another avenue in which through which the EU could exert influence. Yeah, I won't really answer the question in much detail of what else the EU should do from a perspective of just guaranteeing as well economic development and everything for its own citizens. And I think that's quite a separate question that others are better positioned perhaps for.
Wonderful. So I will echo Lau Mein. If you need to go somewhere else, then by all means. But we do in fact have more questions. So if you're up for it.
Yeah, I am curious. So we can maybe do one or two more. Is that all right?
Sure. Okay. So one of the things in your conditional AI treaty was you made some decisions about which things to include and which things to not include. I've listed, like, I tried to sort them kind of here, but it feels my intuition on this is that it's a lot better to only have as little as absolutely possible. So if you can avoid having the treaty cover more things, then it's a lot easier to create the treaty, and you avoid, a lot of potential attack surface. Like Machiavelli has this idea that change is by definition really hard because the supporters are less dedicated than the people who stand to lose by this change. On this list, how do you? I think you cut here in the so including malfunction risks, but not including systemic risks. What are your thoughts in general? Where should we make the cut?
I mean, it's an interesting topic. I and it's not obvious. I think what we should include and what we should not include. I kind of see your argument that we should include as little as possible. However, I also think that we would lose support if we would cut threat models that other people find really important, that are also lobbying for something similar. So if you can make the tent a little bit, and I also think people would be, like, in a sense, disappointed and maybe even hostile towards those pushing the treaty. Let's say we have a situation where, okay, hooray, there's a conditional air safety treaty accepted, and we're now protected from loss of control. And what happens is we get a pandemic and 10% of the world dies because we didn't include this threat model. I mean, that would be quite bad, right? So, and people would say, okay, what the hell have you done with your air safety treaty, and why was this threat model excluded? So I do think it makes sense to be a little bit wider and to also include threat models that's like normal people on the street would find dangerous and worrying. And if we and I would that's one part. Another part is, does the solution kind of follow the same lines? Like the solution that we are proposing is of course, do evaluations, but also if something does not meet the evaluations, then those dangerous training runs should not occur anymore. Does that make sense as a solution for example, labor market risk or environmental risk? And if the answer is no, and insofar the answer is no, then perhaps this should be in a different treaty and in a different paper. So that was one reason why we did not include the systemic risk, and we did include malicious usage, for example.
That's a really good point. Thank you. My model kind of puts a lot of potential popularity on disturbances to the labor market. I think this is probably the one that you could really get a lot of people, marching in the street for. Would you agree with this being like a central part of mobilizing the public?
I do think it's an opportunity in that sense, yes. I also think that most people would say that the solution for this is not to prohibit the technology, but do something about the labor market. Because that has historically been the solution, right? I mean, we always got some kind of technology, and then we got some people losing their jobs, but then the labor market would adjust itself, and in the end, everyone was better off. And it's the classical story, and I think a lot of people assume that it will also be valid for AGI. I am a bit skeptical about this because I think AGI, if it can do any cognitive task better, then there's such a giant part of the labor market that perhaps we are looking at mass unemployment. So it's possible that you will get public support for even not developing the technology at all. But I think it's quite non-obvious that the public will make that shift in a sense, that they do see the problem of them losing their jobs, definitely. But do they also think that AI should prohibit it, or do they think that the labor market should be changed? Or even more ambitious is, do they think that training runs should not be done anymore? And I think if what we're after is the training runs and what we're using is unemployment, then that doesn't really make sense, I think. And I think if it doesn't make sense, then in the end you can also not really use that public sentiment to get the regulation that you need for something else. So for that reason, I mean, I see the mobilization opportunity, especially if we really get mass unemployment, then there will be a massive part of the discussion. However, if you want a different regulation than what makes sense from that development, then I do think it's difficult to use it.
I think I strongly agree with that. I had one other thing here. Yeah. So like imagine we have some kind of, for instance, your conditional AI safety treaty, and in my world, there's kind of two important different scenarios. There's one where the national leaders have a really strong incentive to cheat, and one where the national leaders are convinced of the risk. And these are, to my mind, pretty different in that if you have something like, for instance, with the IAEA, like where the country does in fact have a really strong incentive to build a nuclear bomb, then because a lot of this is things that are really, really hard to measure. Like we can maybe measure chips kind of a little, but it seems really, really difficult. Whereas if we manage to like get really strong arguments, such as we can convince the national leaders of the actual risk, well, then enforcement becomes dramatically easier, because then there are still a number of rogue actors who could feasibly want to do this, but then you have like the FBI you can send after them, and a number of other much more powerful ways of enforcing compliance within the nation, rather than having to rely on something supranational. So this is. Do you agree with this strategic outlook?
I don't think these are interesting scenarios. Yes. And whether your pessimism of scenario one is warranted, yeah, I think, I mean, if national leaders don't think it's in the interest of their country to sign a treaty, then they will not sign this treaty. And if they think it's in the interest of their country to withdraw from an already signed treaty, then they will withdraw, as you saw with Trump and the Paris Agreement. So I mean, they always need to have the perception, and I think it needs to be true as well, that this treaty is in the interest of their country. And I do think that safety treaties are in the interest of citizens of a country, and also of the leaders of that country, because they improve safety of their citizens. That's the obvious reason. And I think people need to be convinced that this is true, especially leaders of the country, but also those in government, and also leaders of the public debate, for this to work. If they're not convinced that it's in their interest, then it will not work, I think.
So there is actually a third option, rather than the country believes it's in their interest and they join, they believe it's not in their interest and then they abstain, and that is some kind of coercion. And one of the organizations that is potentially in a really strong position to coerce countries that are kind of on the fence and would actually like to have their own AGI, but have been forced to sign a treaty and maybe want to cheat on that. You imagine North Korea or something like that. Would be NATO and perhaps more China together. These two countries seem like they could potentially be able to like enforce a treaty. So even though North Korea wants to build AI, they are unable to, because there are like inspections, and I think NATO can do this kind of thing. In particular, if China agrees.
I mean, you would need nuclear first strikes. Like, you have to be willing to do nuclear first strikes in order to actually enforce it. Because otherwise, North Korea. Okay, yeah. But like, you have to actually use nuclear weapons on North Korea on a genocidal level. So it's like, you have to actually be able to pull the trigger when someone says no. And I just don't see NATO being able to pull a trigger. I mean, it's America isn't even willing to pull a trigger and like destroy aid shipments to Yemen in order to stop like a massively disruptive missile campaign, you know, in the perfect, well, no, in like the Red Sea or whatever. So it's like, we're not really talking about something realistic here.
So I pretty much I think I agree somewhat less than you, but I would also like to hear, also, do you, how, like in extremis, would this be a thing that could happen?
I mean, it's a thing that could happen. I think we should look at enforcement in the same way as we're enforcing normal regulation, because I don't think it's a bit of an extraordinary problem, but maybe it's less extraordinary as we sometimes make it out to be. I think we have ways of enforcing. We have ways first of deciding what kind of regulation we do have, and then we have ways to enforce this regulation. And I don't think this should be very different, also internationally, but also nationally, for the regulation that we're discussing right now. We need to come up with something that is enforceable, and I'm not seeing any like non-standard enforcement mechanisms necessary, and I wouldn't propose non-standard enforcement mechanisms to enforce the kind of regulation that we are proposing. So I think we need to propose the kind of regulation that is enforceable with standard mechanisms. I think that's up to us.
Great. I think we have just about covered all the questions. I don't know if there is anyone in the audience who have some other questions. Otherwise, I guess I'll say thank you to you, Otto, for taking the time to answer our questions. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thanks a lot, sir, for hosting me. I also really like the magnitude of the way you're digging into the topic and the questions that you ask. I think that they're quite high quality, and I was quite stimulated in discussing our work here. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Same to you. Bye bye.
Thanks.
Bye.